Iran understands something very important about modern warfare. In a direct conventional battle, the United States has enormous advantages. It has a larger military budget, more advanced weapon systems, global bases, powerful intelligence networks, and decades of operational experience. Trying to defeat that kind of military power head-on would be extremely risky, but the goal of strategy is not always to defeat the opponent in the way they expect. The goal is to force the opponent into a situation where their advantages become less useful and their weaknesses become more visible. In other words, the goal is not necessarily to win the battle in the traditional sense. The goal is to shape the conflict in a way that changes what victory even means. This is where the idea of asymmetric warfare becomes extremely important. Asymmetric warfare means a conflict between two sides that have very different levels of power and different kinds of capabilities. The stronger side often expects the war to follow conventional patterns. They expect clear battlefields, identifiable targets, centralized command structures, and predictable chains of command. But the weaker side often refuses to fight that kind of war. Instead, they create a system where the battlefield becomes fragmented, decisions are decentralized, and the enemy cannot easily identify where the center of power actually exists. From a strategic perspective, Iran has been preparing for this type of conflict for many years. Their objective is not to defeat the United States in a traditional military sense. Their objective is to create a situation where the cost of defeating Iran becomes so high that the United States eventually decides the war is not worth continuing. This is a very different definition of victory. Instead of winning by conquering territory or destroying armies, victory comes from making the opponent unable to define a clear path to success. One of the key features of this strategy is the distribution of leadership and decision-making. In many traditional military systems, leadership is centralized. If you remove the top leaders, the system can become disorganized. That is why modern militaries often focus on what they call decapitation strikes. The idea is simple. If you eliminate the leadership, the organization collapses. But this strategy becomes much less effective when leadership is distributed across multiple networks and multiple groups. When decision-making is decentralized, removing one leader does not necessarily stop the system from functioning. Other leaders can continue operating, and the overall strategy continues moving forward. This creates a massive strategic problem for the United States. If leadership is distributed, then targeting individual leaders does not necessarily end the conflict. If decision-making is decentralized, predicting the opponent's next move becomes extremely difficult. And if authority is dispersed across multiple networks, negotiating with a single central authority becomes almost impossible. The result is a situation where the stronger military power finds itself fighting an enemy that cannot easily be defeated through traditional military methods. At the same time, the conflict does not exist in isolation. The Middle East is a region filled with complex alliances, rivalries, economic dependencies, and religious divisions. Any large conflict between Iran and the United States immediately pulls other actors into the situation. One of the most important of these actors is Israel. Israel views Iran as one of its primary strategic threats. Because of this, Israeli leadership has strong incentives to weaken Iranian influence across the region. But the strategy being pursued goes beyond simple military confrontation. One of the patterns that begins to emerge in this conflict is the creation of regional instability in multiple locations at the same time. When instability spreads across different countries simultaneously, it forces regional powers to divide their attention and their resources. A good example of this dynamic can be seen in the situation involving Bahrain. On the surface, unrest in Bahrain might appear to be an internal political issue. Protests, opposition movements, and demands for political reform can all be interpreted as domestic developments. But the timing and coordination of such events can sometimes suggest something more complex. If protests and political crises emerge at the same moment that larger geopolitical tensions are rising, it raises an important question about whether these events are purely spontaneous or whether they are part of a broader strategic environment. Bahrain is not just any small country in the Gulf. It has deep security ties with Saudi Arabia. The two countries are closely connected politically and militarily. Saudi Arabia maintains significant influence over Bahrain's security situation, and the Saudi military has previously intervened there to stabilize the government. Because of this relationship, instability in Bahrain automatically creates pressure on Saudi Arabia to respond. If Saudi Arabia feels compelled to deploy troops into Bahrain in order to stabilize the government, that decision has important strategic consequences. Military deployments require resources, attention, logistics, and political commitment. Once troops are committed to one crisis, they are not available for other potential conflicts. This is how regional crises can become traps. By forcing a country to respond to one emergency, you reduce its ability to respond to another. From Iran's perspective, the goal is not necessarily to directly confront Saudi Arabia or the United States in every location. The goal is to create multiple situations where regional actors feel compelled to act. Each action they take draws them deeper into the overall conflict structure. Each decision increases the complexity of the situation. And as the complexity grows, the strategic environment becomes more chaotic and harder to control. At the center of this entire system lies one of the most important geographic locations in global energy markets, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world's oceans. A significant portion of global oil shipments passes through this strait every day. Because of this, any military conflict in the region immediately raises questions about the security of global energy supplies. If the strait becomes threatened or partially blocked, the consequences extend far beyond the Middle East. Energy prices rise, shipping routes become uncertain, insurance costs increase, and global markets begin to react. Countries in Europe and Asia that rely on energy imports from the Gulf suddenly find themselves facing economic uncertainty. In this way, a regional conflict can quickly become a global economic issue. Iran understands the strategic importance of this location. Control over the Strait of Hormuz does not necessarily require permanent closure of the waterway. Even the possibility of disruption can influence markets and political decisions. If the world begins to believe that energy supplies are at risk, pressure begins to build on governments that are involved in the conflict. Economic concerns begin to shape political calculations. At the same time, the war itself begins to evolve. The conflict expands beyond traditional military engagements and starts to include attacks on infrastructure, economic systems, and political alliances. Oil facilities become potential targets because they represent critical economic assets. Energy infrastructure is often concentrated in specific geographic locations, which makes it vulnerable to disruption. Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, particularly in the eastern region of the country, represents one of the most important components of the global energy system. Large facilities process massive quantities of oil every day, and the global market depends on the continuous operation of these installations. If these facilities are damaged or destroyed, the consequences ripple across the entire international economy. This is not merely a theoretical possibility. Previous attacks on Saudi oil facilities have demonstrated how vulnerable this infrastructure can be. Even a limited strike can temporarily remove a significant portion of global oil supply from the market. That experience serves as a reminder that energy infrastructure is both strategically valuable and strategically fragile. In a full-scale regional conflict, attacks on oil facilities could become much more systematic. Instead of isolated incidents, multiple facilities could be targeted in coordinated strikes. The objective would not simply be to cause temporary disruption, but to significantly reduce production capacity. If enough facilities are damaged, the economic consequences would extend far beyond the region. For the United States, this creates a complex dilemma. The original goal of military intervention might be to weaken Iran's strategic position, but if the conflict leads to widespread destruction of regional energy infrastructure, the economic consequences could affect allies and global markets. Instead of stabilizing the region, the war could produce the opposite result. And this is where the deeper strategic trap begins to emerge. The United States enters the conflict believing it possesses overwhelming military power, but the structure of the conflict slowly transforms into something much more complicated. The battlefield expands across multiple countries, economic systems become vulnerable, and political alliances begin to experience strain. The longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it becomes to achieve a clear and decisive outcome. What initially appears to be a straightforward military confrontation gradually turns into a complex strategic environment where every action produces unintended consequences. The stronger military power finds itself responding to events rather than controlling them. And as the situation evolves, the original objectives of the war become harder and harder to define. The result is a strategic landscape in which victory is no longer measured by battlefield success alone. Victory becomes a question of endurance, political stability, economic resilience, and public perception. And in that kind of environment, the traditional advantages of military strength do not always produce the results that policymakers expect. As the conflict expands across the region, the strategic environment begins to change in ways that many policymakers in Washington may not initially anticipate. At the beginning of a war, governments often focus on military capability. They look at the number of aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missile systems, and advanced weapons platforms that each side possesses. From that perspective, the balance of power appears overwhelmingly tilted towards the United States and its regional partners. But wars are rarely decided purely by the number of weapons each side possesses. They are often decided by the structure of the conflict itself, by the incentives facing each actor, and by the economic and political consequences that unfold as the war continues. One of the most important vulnerabilities in the regional system lies in the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the largest oil producers in the world, and much of its production capacity is concentrated in a relatively small number of massive facilities located in the eastern part of the country. These installations process enormous quantities of oil every single day, and they represent a central pillar of the global energy market. When oil flows smoothly from these facilities into international markets, the global economy functions relatively normally. But when that flow is disrupted, the consequences can be immediate and dramatic. The vulnerability of this infrastructure was demonstrated several years ago when drones and missiles struck a major Saudi oil processing facility, temporarily removing a significant portion of the country's oil production from the market. Even though that disruption was temporary, the impact on global oil prices was immediate. Markets reacted with anxiety, governments began discussing emergency energy reserves, and the incident revealed how fragile the global energy system can be when a small number of facilities play such a critical role. That earlier attack served as a warning. It demonstrated that modern energy infrastructure, despite its enormous scale, can still be extremely vulnerable to relatively precise strikes. In a full-scale conflict scenario, those strikes would not necessarily be limited to a single facility. Instead, they could become part of a broader campaign targeting multiple sites simultaneously. The goal of such a campaign would not simply be symbolic retaliation. It would be strategic disruption. If several major oil facilities were damaged at the same time, the cumulative effect could significantly reduce Saudi Arabia's ability to maintain its level of production. That reduction would immediately ripple through the global energy market. Oil prices would begin to climb sharply as traders and governments attempted to secure alternative supplies.